Alrighty, well, good morning, folks. We're going to wait just a moment until we hit noon before we get started to allow a few more folks to join us. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. I'm sure many of us are snowed in. So thank you for being with us on this snowy Monday afternoon now. We have our friends from UVA with us today, familiar faces and names most likely for many of you, Ian Baxter and Meredith Keppel, with the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at the University of Virginia. They are presenting a session that was presented with us this past year at our conference, and it was so popular that we're presenting it again in webinar format. So Facilitation for Impact, Strengthening Community Engagement and Planning. So I know that this will be a great webinar. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. You may have noted on this first slide, CM information to come. Unfortunately, due to APA National's upgrade to their website and the subsequent tech issues that they are running into, we have yet to be able to access the CM portal. So as soon as that information becomes available and our PDO is able to certify the webinar, we will get that information posted to our website, sent out an e-blast, and get it to you. And we can confirm that this session will be certified. So along that same note, we are also having difficulties updating our website due to the same technological problems. However, all conference-related updates on our conference website, which I'll link in the chat, those are all live and up to date. Our RFP for sessions is closing in 2 days. So if you are interested in participating as a speaker at our upcoming conference in Danville, please submit some session proposals. I'll also make sure to link some of that information in the chat once we get started as well. This will be an interactive webinar. So I know that there will be a couple of times in which our speakers will encourage you to put information in the chat box. But if you have any questions, please submit those through the Q&A feature, just so that will help me keep track of all inquiries. You can also use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud. And I think that about covers it. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared to our YouTube page in the coming days, where you can find all previously recorded webinars in the series, and that will also go in the chat in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ian and Meredith, but thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon. I think this will be a great webinar.
Thank you. I'm just going to take a sec to share my screen. All right. You all can see that, I assume?
Yes.
Great. Well, yeah, good afternoon. My name is Ian Baxter. I'm a senior associate here at the Institute for Engagement Negotiation. I'm here with my colleague, Meredith Keppel. And today, oh yeah, go ahead, Meredith, please.
No, I was just going to say hi, everyone.
Yeah. Very happy to be with you today, braving well, I guess we're not braving anything because we're all inside, but I'm really grateful that the power held and we were able to give this webinar. Title of our conversation today is Facilitating for Impact, and we're going to be talking about strengthening community engagement in planning through some of the ways that we work at IEN.
Absolutely. So let's start off, and this will be a familiar slide. This might even be a very familiar presentation to those of you who were at our conference presentation last summer. But let's start off with talking about like what usually happens. So a case study, a typical IEN case study might be, well, imagine a 900-acre solar farm. It's proposed on a retiring farmer's land. He's cash poor, land rich. He wants to cash out on that a little bit while keeping it in the family. So he's going to lease it to a solar farm. There is some issues with potential growth zones nearby. Maybe even there's rumor of a potential cemetery on the site. There's a divided community over this. There's economic benefits to it, sure, but there's also some environmental, historic, aesthetic, cultural concerns. Now, this might even be a tired story to some of you at this point, one that we've heard over and over. But what usually happens in this process is we, as the planners, get together a plan. We consult experts, we are experts, we pull together impact analysis and looking at all sorts of different parts as a permit comes in, request for us, right? We have the community really up in arms. They push back. They say, no, we're not doing this. So at the town hall, it disrupts into yelling and arguing, and we get a ton of public comments. And the city council or the county board of supervisors says, fix this, right? And then we're bringing a third party. They give us more expertise. The community gets more divided and tells us more and more, no, stop doing this. You're not listening to us. What are you even thinking? And we go, hey, I'm the expert here. You're not listening to me. I'm telling you there's no impact on this, or we're mitigating this impact here. And the community goes, you know nothing. You're not part of this community, right? You know this story. It gets polarized, it's divided, and more we feel like, are we even listened to? Well, we're here to talk about how to do it a little differently.
Yeah, and so we are both senior associates here at the Institute for Engagement Negotiations. So we were founded in 1980. We're a public service organization that's now part of the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service here at UVA. And our mission really is facilitating shared solutions through effective collaboration, research, and training. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this framework of effective collaboration and some of the steps that we use to facilitate equitable public processes that to the extent possible, produce durable outcomes that serve as many community members as possible. But I should also note that until about 2 years ago, I think, the IEN was at the architecture school here at UVA, primarily focusing initially on environmental mediation and environmental planning. So our change to the Weldon Cooper Center is pretty recent, but it really makes sense, and we're really excited to be at the Weldon Cooper Center. So I'm going to talk quickly about what we call the 6 key principles of effective collaboration. It was developed here at IEN by some of our colleagues. Frank Dukes is a name some of you may know that was really a key sort of developer of this. Thinking about this as a reaction to standard community and public engagement processes that are, hearings or ad hoc committees, typically, they're ineffective, right? They may often perpetuate longstanding structural or personal power imbalances. They may only attract a limited group of power players that have a vested interest or maybe a financial interest in the project. And this limited group of people often excludes others. And maybe those that do participate are frustrated, cynical, or disengaged. So kind of exactly what Meredith just described, but from a more conceptual framework. And so effective collaboration is a framework to basically guide people on how to deliberate honestly, openly, and with concern to not perpetuate some of the trauma and harm that previous processes have created. And so it's six components. So I'll go through each very briefly, and we'll talk about how we sort of tie this into our work in a moment. So the first step for this is that effective collaboration is trauma-informed. So thinking about focusing on relationships and preparing to support people in ways that prevent, minimize, or mitigate renewed trauma, or actually seek to stop developing, renewed trauma, seek to stop developing new trauma through a public process. It's inclusive and accessible, so it's reaching to the extent possible all segments of the community. It's acknowledging the racial, ethnic, gender, class, and other dynamics that might be integral for someone's ability to participate in a public setting. It also works to remove barriers and ensure that the content is accessible for all participants. It's responsive. We'll talk about this later, is that, we really believe in sort of understanding and adjusting as needed, to the community questions, needs, concerns in a meaningful way. So trying to get away from the sort of rote or sort of, not actually sort of delivering a response to public comment and needs. So we're not just soliciting public comment, we're trying to implement it. It's deliberative, so we call them brave spaces, but there are places where participants prioritize curiosity before judgment and try to basically learn and grow and solve a problem together. That's truth-seeking, so we're talking about inviting honest, more complete histories, especially when those histories are painful to hear and understand. Obviously, there's a little bit of a trade-off between that and being trauma-informed, so you want to make sure you're telling the full story, but not in a way that perpetuates or renews harm. And then finally, it's adaptive. So thinking about developing appropriate goals and processes for each situation. So we write plenty of proposals with our clients that the actual process ends up looking very different from by the time we're done with the process because of the different actors or the different circumstances that have evolved as a part of our public engagement process.
So let's talk about where these public processes kind of develop from in an IEN world. Bringing it back around to our case study, if we think about the example of a solar farm and someone who is conducting as a planner public comment and then immediately going, well, that's not a valid concern. This isn't a valid concern. I looked into that. I researched this. And it's not that you're wrong. Maybe you did research it. Maybe we did look into the stormwater impacts of the solar panels or whether there's a cemetery on site or thinking about whether or not it's going to impact the county's plans for affordable housing in the future. But if the community does not feel it is responsive, adaptive, and able to be deliberative in that way, where we're asking for public comment and then we're coming back and we're iteratively involving that into our process, how do we change? How do we show them that that is something that is considered? So that's where we have these three processes, these three phases. Phase one, we really focus the difference between IEN and I think a typical community engagement or public participation process is the conceiving. We focus very heavily on the beginning, on that first step before we even get to the meeting. What's the lay of the land? What are the key concerns and issues that stakeholders are bringing up? What are our goal statements, which we'll get to later? And then we go into that conducting, and we might at any point in time go backwards, right? And the thing that also maybe differentiates us is the completing process. We think about durable solutions. Can everyone live with the final agreement? And maybe you might not be able to live with every component of it, or maybe you might not be the biggest fan of every component of it, but can you live with every component? And are you committed to working to support implementation of the full agreement and not just the parts you like, right? If these elements aren't true for participants, you don't have authentic consensus. So that's where we find it really important to be interconnected and adaptive and cyclical about this process.
Great. So let's talk about phase one, which is conceiving the process. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that we use in a moment. Actually, for each of these steps, we will. But the key elements, like Meredith described, is really thinking about a full and comprehensive understanding of the interest and issues at play, right? So what we want to do is we want to come in, understand some of the key issue in the case of the solar farm, right? The actual presence of a solar development is the key issue. But some of the underlying keys might be loss of an agricultural identity of a place, right? Historical, erasure of a potential cemetery that could pose a significant historical erasure, right? By understanding and talking to, and we usually do this in conjunction with our client, and in our interviews, ask people, well, who else should we talk to so that we get, to the extent possible, a full understanding of the interests and issues at play, because almost always it will be a set of things that are not just in your sort of problem statement, what you were initially brought there to do. It's almost always a sort of a composite of different issues that bring together one issue that everyone agrees needs to be solved. Understanding the players and representatives necessary for success. So there are two different groups of people. I would say that, typically in the planning world, we're really concerned with who needs to be there. Maybe they're statutorily required, or it's someone that the county administrator, city manager has asked you, this person needs to be involved in this group, right? So you might need their signature, you might need it to go before a board that they share, et cetera, et cetera. But often you have these players that are maybe they're community leaders, right? They're not necessarily statutorily designated or even elected. They're like influencers. We often call them community connectors. These are like the people that manage sort of a lot of other people, right? They interface with a lot of people. They are influential and just generally important. And also the regular, members of the public that might have a vested interest. Either they live near whatever development is happening, or they're just curious. They have a degree or some sort of expertise in it. So you have to know the players, and you have to understand their dimensions of influence and kind of really how important they are as a part of any process. And that's something where you have to apply kind of your own rationale there. You have to kind of make some of those decisions. But it's really important, I think, the broader point is that you really want to separate out the players from the representatives necessary for success, because they might be the same person, but in many cases they might not be. And then finally, we're really thinking about drafting a process that fosters the 6 principles of effective collaboration, right? So are we being truth-seeking? Are we being trauma-informed? Are we making sure that we're going to be adapting the process as it moves forward? So we do this through a variety of different tools. And I would say one of my favorite parts about working at IEN is conducting the stakeholder or the situation assessment, which is basically what we call a very brief sort of memo report that we often produce for clients after a series of interviews with some of the folks that they've recommended us, some of the folks that have been recommend us, right? It's sort of going through this sort of web of influence and interest in whatever issue that you're determining. And what we often do is come up with the situation assessment. So it's us sort of trying to the extent possible, kind of formalize or uh, have as a framework that dictates how we're going to be addressing this problem. So what are the key issues that need to be addressed? Are there any areas that we've already recognized as mutual areas of mutual agreement? Are there any education needs? Does it seem like one group has a lot of information that the other doesn't, that they might need to be sort of educate, have the education necessary to make a good decision? And we do this in person. I can think of an example recently where we were working on an issue involving historic bridge in Louisa. We went out to town of Louisa, in and around Green Springs Historic Districts, interviewing folks in person, over the phone, in small groups as necessary and appropriate. And what we did is eventually created what we call a shared goal statement. So what that isn't is here's what will happen and it'll satisfy everybody. That is not what a shared goal statement is, because in many cases there are conflicting viewpoints and values that may not be able to be reconciled. But what a shared goal statement is, it's more about the process. So it's thinking about if we address these concerns, maybe they don't necessarily go one person's way or another, but if these are part of any agreement or end of a process, then we feel like it's sort of covered the problem, which we again understand almost always to be deeper than there's going to be something built here or this bridge might be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. We also sort of develop these process protocols and expectations. A lot of it is some of the protocols and expectations is respect others in meetings, right? We try and kind of move away from some of the animosity that we find at board meetings, planning commission meetings. Really trying to take the temperature down, quite honestly, in a lot of these situations that we're coming in after long-standing disagreements almost always. So we don't pretend to know what's happening without trusting those that we're talking to. We also don't pretend to understand that, or sort of that any of this will just be solved if we have the right information. We're here to facilitate a process, and we're here to make sure that folks are going to be treated with respect, treat others with respect, and also make sure that they understand our timeline, our client's timeline, so that they can be informed. And that, like Meredith mentioned earlier, a lot of times people get involved in a policy issue at the end of the thing. Hey, we're having a public hearing. We've already decided what this is going to be, but we need a public hearing to kind of make it legal. So those are some of the key tools that we use. And Meredith will walk you all through an example.
Yeah, actually, Ian, can we go back for 2 seconds?
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say for the shared goal statement, this is a thing that I think a lot of people have trouble sometimes conceptualizing. Everyone's on vastly different sides. And so I'll give a quick example. IEN got brought into, some of you may have heard, in Rockbridge County, there's a Boy Scout group that has a dam, and it is a dam that has been grandfathered in. It's a very old dam, and so it has had some issues when the drawdown happens, and it causes some sedimentation in the downstream river, which then causes fish die-offs, and there was all sorts of there's consent orders. There's all sorts of things over the last 30, 40 years. There's been disagreements and uproar over this, in part because it's also the DC Council of Boy Scouts who owns the camp that surrounds this dam, Lake Meriwether. And the local community is kind of okay, so the DC people come down to Rockbridge County and hurt our river where we recreate, and you're just here for extractive purposes. One of the things that we had to do in order to move this process forward was to help them find commonality. And that's where I think that shared goal statement comes in, is it's how far do you have to zoom out to find where we all have something in common? What is that moment where we can get really the beginnings, the seeds planted for consensus? And for that situation, it was zooming out enough to say, okay, Boy Scouts who are here to learn about recreating and conservation, and local community who's here who cares about recreating and conservation. You're on different ends of a dam, the lake and the river, but you both really care about stewarding this land. And that really resonated with them. And so a good facilitator of a public process will look through these goal statements or look through these different stakeholder interviews as they emerge and say, okay, what is something that's a commonality here in what we need and what we want and what we're looking towards the vision? One element of, okay, we can go forward. One element of a stakeholder or a situation assessment is a stakeholder mapping process. So I want everyone to just briefly pop in the chat one person who might fall under one of these four categories, and some of them are really obvious. So, just go ahead and pop anyone in there and tell me which category they pop into in the situation of the solar case study. I'll start and say a really key impacted party that people might forget about is potential future people who would live there. By putting a solar farm there, now that's a hard one to quantify. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't write it down. But it's a key one. I'm watching the chat and hoping people start putting some things in here. Another good opposed one, wildlife resources. Andrea, where would you put that? Would you put that under opposed? Decision makers, technical information impacted, adjacent property owners, they can get impacted. They can be under several different ones too. They might have technical information, right? We might need DWR to come in and tell us about what wildlife is going to be impacted by this. The ag community definitely might be impacted, may be opposed, may not be. It depends. The decision makers sometimes planners definitely have technical information. I would say decision makers, people typically say is board of supervisors, right? Or city council. In this case, likely board of supervisors. But they can delegate that authority, right? The board of supervisors delegates authority to the planning commission, for example. The planning commission, in some cases, I've seen people make, subcommittees of the planning commission to investigate the potential of a amendment to solar ordinances, right? Those kinds of things. It depends on what our process comes in at. Are we at a permit hearing, or are we considering, okay, this permit really didn't go well, we need to reconsider our ordinances, right? So this is a particular topic here. Yeah, there's a lot of different things to think about. Thinking about, how the technical information is one that I think it's easy to think through a million different people who might have technical information, and some of your stakeholders might have technical information as well as we said, be impacted and opposed. But your technical information, really be judicious about who you invite, because you want to make sure you're leveling the playing field by giving people the right information without bringing in sources of information that are so biased that it feels as though you are then trying to sway the group one way or another. You don't want to lose your authenticity as a facilitator of the process. Yeah, absolutely. Feel impacted can be both positive and negative. So think broadly about people or parties who should be engaged. Very good point, Farron. Let's go on to our next one, Ian.
Cool. So we're going to talk now about the actual conducting the consultation or process. And so this is sort of what people think of, the step that people think of when they think of a public engagement process, right? The actual having the meetings, getting the input from the meetings, developing the solutions from the meetings. What we find to be the most helpful is these are very helpfully bolded in blue with some of the most important points. But again, like we kind of described earlier, thinking about shared goals, or maybe a better term for that in some cases is joint criteria for expectations for success. And so what this typically means is we're thinking about an agreed upon set of standards that everyone agrees is important, right? So in the case of, I can go back to my bridge that we just wrapped up lately. We were thinking about public safety, the actual efficacy, the use of the road, right? This was a bridge that is in use in Louisa County. So like, can people use the road? Can emergency vehicles use the road? Can the big trucks and tractors that all these farmers who live by it use the road, right? We can also talk about the historic value of the bridge. Are we retaining any of the original bridge, right? Are we retaining or sort of commemorating or otherwise interpreting the historical value of this bridge, right? And then are we also doing something that's cost effective, considering the use of money would come from VDOT, or the money would come from potentially VDOT or County Louisa, or a mix of both, right? So these are all things that people agree are important. There was a ginormous variance in how much what people thought of how important each of those were, right? I mean, a huge variance, right? But those are all the joint criteria for success. And so we'll talk a little bit about, agreement and consensus building in a little bit. But I think getting to that, I think, is really, really important, because what it does is it kind of allows you to then move forward with a process when you have an agreement of what is important. Again, you do not need to have an agreement on how important each of those things are, but it really, really helps to have a set of joint criteria that is, at least everyone's living in sort of the same, reality in that moment. We're also looking to develop options for mutual gain. And this, again, I talked about situation assessments being a great part of this job, but I really love this part about working for this idea of mutual gain, right? Understanding that In some cases, yes, there are mutually exclusive outcomes, right? Where one party loses and one party wins, right? That's how we're sort of brought up to understand how things end up, especially in a public process. But embedded within that spectrum actually is a really an awesome opportunity for mutual gain, right? And so really kind of if you think about these different joint criteria as kind of like 0 to 100, kind of like bar charts or whatever, like can you like play around, and this is as a facilitator and sort of guardian of a public process, you can be working with the state and you can kind of ask these crazy questions of the state, like, hey, would you guys consider doing this? Like, is this illegal? Or like, would you ever think of doing this? We heard this from someone that maybe they've had a lot of experience with and they don't want to deal with anymore. And we can kind of be that messenger to get to really like what is possible and what isn't possible. And we're obviously understanding that we're working within parameters of statutory parameters, financial barriers or parameters, time, all that stuff. We understand that and we're not naive, but coming up with those ideas and options for mutual gain keeps people engaged in the process to see what they want sort of reflected in these goals. And also it gives them closure where it's like, for example, like we want to keep the bridge as is, totally do not change. We can provide the engineering schematics to sort of why the state will not agree with that, right? That's important. Here's what they're telling you. You can take their word for it, but here's sort of a response directly to that concern. We also we sort of use those joint criteria to evaluate and refine the options. And also, like Meredith mentioned, we're really, really interested in having implementation be durable. So it's not just a signature and a gavel strike at a public board meeting or whatever. Like this is something that'll be implementable, it'll be trackable. We'll talk a little bit about that in our next phase of the process.
All right, I just threw something in the chat there, but I want to mention that developing options for mutual gain shifts that conversation, like we were talking about in the beginning about, this doesn't work. Well, you haven't even considered this, and you don't know the landscape of planning, and I'm the expert here in planning. Why aren't you listening to me? Instead of doing that, to offer, here is a consideration of how to be creative and open and take the idea that someone has based on their lived experience and say, what can we do to make this work? What might be feasible? And that requires some curiosity and some creativity, and just allowing things to be thrown at spaghetti at the wall for a while in that brainstorming phase. Part of this, though, is a really important component of when you are setting the stage in conceiving the process, and then how you communicate this information in conducting the process is what we call defining the sandbox. It's asking what can be done by whom and when. And I love Ian's example of the bridge because they really had to be clear on this with VDOT to be able to communicate it to their public stakeholders. VDOT has a long manual of things that they have to do a certain way, right? And that is their statutory and their regulatory and their legal obligation. So we need to think through, when it comes to a process, how are we communicating to our stakeholders what they actually have influence over? Because to walk into a meeting and say, give me public comment on what you think of this bridge is disingenuous. We're not actually asking for whether or not they think that it should be load bearing, right? Like we shouldn't offer things that they actually can't impact the ultimate outcome of. So really getting clear on that with if it's your city council, if it's you're working with state agency, if it's your planning commission, what it is that you can really offer people. And so, Ian, if we can go to the next slide. We call this, as stewards of a public process, we look to, Ian, if you could put the name in the chat for me, the AIP2, the Institute or AIP2. Wait, hold on. IAP2. Thank you. Wait, my brain is backwards today. I'm thinking AICP and I've got my brain backwards. International Association of Public Participation is IAP2, and they offer us kind of our code of conduct, our ethics and rights and responsibilities as facilitators of a public process. One thing that looks like when you translate that information into a planning process is to think about, are we asking for information from them? Or rather, are we giving information to them? Is it a city publication and then we're just putting it out there because we have to, or, offering public comment? And how can we clarify in that public comment, there are elements of this that are already established and what elements of it might be up for debate. Maybe there's mapping that's not up for debate and there's offerings of scenario planning that is, or maybe it's, mapping that is up for debate. We're willing to look at, oh, you have flooding in your region that wasn't shown on this map. We want to know, like catch the king tide, if those of you are familiar with it. Consult, right? Are you actually genuinely looking for feedback? That might be more like a town hall, right? And what aspects of it, again, are you looking for information on? Are you looking to do a participatory mapping project? Involve, that's more like the workshop. Again, this is getting even more than a participatory mapping. You're looking towards like a charrette type thing. You're looking for information on design. You're looking for what people value in something. Collaborate, that's again more time. And this is a spectrum too of how involved people are. And we need to remember that we are honoring the time that they're giving us free to be able to offer their input on this. So collaborate, a task force, again, we talked about, such as a subcommittee of the planning commission or of city council, depending on how your or board of supervisors, depending on how your locality puts it together. Empower, that might be voting. We've seen participatory budgeting start happening in Richmond, right? These are all methods at which to creatively embellish and to change and to shift up the or enhance, really, and enhance the public participation process.
Yeah, and so just to kind of wrap up, this part of the phase two, conducting the process, we're developing shared goals that we hope to build trust and clarity among participants, so they understand that we've heard them, we've incorporated it into this sort of criteria and set of goals that will inform the decision-making mechanism. Mutual education, so we bring in technical experts, community experts all the time to our meetings to help sort of establish or sort of provide sort of proof that we're establishing a baseline set of information. We obviously work to make sure that's accessible and understandable, especially in the case of a bridge we were talking about, and we were working with PEs. Like, I didn't really understand what they were talking about, so I was like, we need to make this digestible for the average person. We're not just going to go up and say, oh, we showed them like the renderings and like here's, they should understand why it's, for example, structurally unsound or not, whatever. So we're trying to empower people to be equally informed, to contribute meaningfully. And then, yeah, generating evaluating options together that enables creative, inclusive solutions, to the extent possible. And so I really want to like tie this up with like some of you may be like, oh, well, like that all sounds nice. Like that sounds really nice. Like, and it might good job, you guys, but like wherever I work, like we couldn't do this for whatever reason. And I think it's important to kind of like we're both, we have planning backgrounds. We understand the sort of all of the limitations associated with planning and public participation. But I think when you do kind of shift your focus or your mindset to kind of allowing maybe, some of this creativity to seep into those processes, you really can you really reap what you sow. And I just wanted to offer that like, we're not trying to, this isn't just totally sort of like pie in the sky naivete. Like we've seen this work. We've seen people become part of processes that they otherwise wouldn't have been and actually were integral components to them being successful in the future. But there's going to be some hiccups, there's going to be some tension, and it's our role to foster and facilitate that and move it towards a positive outcome to the extent possible. And I think this is our last step, phase 3 of our 3 phases. It's completing the process. Oftentimes this looks like a signature, right? Or like I said, a gavel hit, or a motion to conclude public comment, right? We've heard that a lot. Okay, great, we did it. What we try and offer this as is thinking about the actual development and implementation of a solution. And so obviously we're looking, and if you've laid the sort of the groundwork in a way that has been inclusive, has maybe put in some of those equitable or the effective collaboration components, thinking about an agreement that is legitimate and effective, we feel confident in a lot of our work that we can say this is a legitimate agreement because of who is involved, because of who we recruited to be involved, how we presented the information, et cetera. Like, we're trying to sort of create like a dossier of like, here's like how we did it. And we want to be transparent with participants and whatever governing board or agency we're working with and justify all of our decisions. So that actually might end up costing more money, to be frank. And that's something that we feel like is justifiable, right? Because we're thinking about the implementation of a solution, right? We're not just thinking about, oh, we did the process. Thanks. Thanks you for coming. Here's your, $5 gift card or whatever. We obviously need to obtain approvals and ratifications. So this might be going for a governing board. This might be sending it to a subcommittee or whatever. We need to do that, right, when we're working within the context of a series of rules, local or state or national. And then what we often do is we evaluate the process and outcomes with participants. So after it's over, or maybe at that last meeting, we'll have them fill out a brief survey, maybe follow up with them in a few months once the whatever they've sort of agreed upon or whatever ended up getting signed is in play, and really help us understand like what we did wrong or what we did right. and use that and have humility to recognize that best laid plans, might not always be the best thing, right? And I think that humility as a planner is like really important and something that I've learned a lot from being at IEN. Coming from a PDC background, you're kind of by the book, right, in a lot of cases. But what we want to make sure is that we understand and are confident enough in our work that we're ready to take that criticism if it comes our way. And maybe it's good feedback. I don't know. Maybe we did a good job. And then also addressing and planning for successful implementation, right? So we're looking to create mechanisms where there's sort of constant, looking, measuring, putting in some metrics that are actually going to be accomplished over the course of whatever's implementation, whether that's, public feedback solicited further along in the process, whether that's checking in with those that are involved in whatever process, but like implementation starts when the agreement's signed, and that's a part of a process. That's not a separate thing. We may not be the sort of guardians of that implementation, but we are trying to set it up to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just add to this real quick, Ian. I also come from a PDC background, and the process of community engagement is often dinged as this, like, we're just trying to buy people's good graces, right? And I think that is where we get into trouble of thinking about this as a like you said, a box we have to check, right? That we are either doing this just to get it done and to say we did it and to meet our legal obligation. But what ends up happening in many, many cases, and more so, I'm sure local planners, you're seeing this happen too, is then they come to us, and you pay a lot more money when you come to us to be able to work backwards and unravel some of the distrust that's been sown in now at this point. So we are giving these presentations over and over to folks in other areas because we want this to be something where you don't get into quite the tangled ball of yarn that ends up coming to us, and we can help break down some of the barriers in a local process that cause polarization in every subsequent issue. And one way to show people that I think we missed earlier to say, but is to reflect back to them at every meeting when it's done. Part of the process is putting out notes on what was said, and how that is then in defining the sandbox. A component of this is showing, okay, you told me this thing. This was how it was either considered, deliberated, put into practice, considered as part of the monitoring plan or the implementation process or in the approvals, whatever it is, making sure that we are reflecting back to folks, because knowing that people aren't in the room all the time, whether it's at city council in a public meeting or it's just in the planning office and we're all, talking about whether or not this is something that is to be considered, right? That we could actually do. And so just remembering that the more transparency you can offer people along the way, the greater the trust that you build. Okay. So let's talk about one of the tools for completing the process. And this is something that people groan when they hear consensus. They're like, you want me to build consensus? One way that we do this is, instead of a binary vote of yes, no, consensus, whether or not you achieve full consensus, you can get a lot of information out of a consensus vote or a consensus process. So Jillian, can you launch the tool in just a second? Not quite yet, but just a second. We're going to do a sample of this. We use a 3 gradient scale. You can go up to 5. I find that's a little too complicated, but 3, I've actually seen more than 5, but 3 is my favorite. Fully support is 3, means that you love the proposal that's been put forward. No changes. 2 is, I've got some notes. I would like some changes. I could live with it if it moved forward, but I would make some changes if I could to strengthen it. 1 is, no, I can't live with this. Stop. Nope. And so what our goal is to have no ones. The ideal is to have all 3s. Every time we hit a 1, we would go to that person and say, okay, what would shift you to a 2 or 3? What do you need to shift? And then we edit the proposal and we recalibrate, right? So we're going to put forward the proposal that after this, we're all going for ice cream. And I'm going to ask you, Jillian, now to launch the poll for us. And I would love you all to tell us how you feel about going for ice cream after this. It won't let me, or do we not have anyone who's seen it yet?
They are responding. I'm just going to wait until it gets to
Okay.
about 70% participation, and then
Okay, cool.
I'll share the results.
I was going to say, I can't see the results, and so I don't know how how far along we are, but we'll give it just a second. So what might keep you from wanting to go for ice cream? And if anyone wants to put why they're a one in the chat, or if they're a two, what would move them to a three in the chat? Or you can unmute if we want to ask people to unmute for that. Weather conditions. Yeah, that would
Okay.
lactose intolerant. Depends on the location, diet. See, these are all really good answers. Too far away, right? So me and Ian are in Charlottesville. If you're in Dickinson County, you might not want to come for ice cream here. Weather conditions, even within Charlottesville, might keep me from wanting to go. Now, if we're all having ice cream over Zoom, we might all be in favor of it, depending on whether you have ice cream in your freezer. So yeah, so that's something, for some of the people who are saying, lactose intolerant, if I said, we're going to go somewhere, I'm editing the proposal now, I would say, we're going somewhere where there's lactose intolerant options. Somebody said weather. Okay, we're going to go somewhere with lactose intolerant options, and there will be a remote participation option, right? So those are ways in which, and then you retest once you've gone through kind of all the ones, and some of them might edit one way or the other, right? You might never be able to achieve consensus with a certain group. One person might say we have to be in person because I hate Zoom, I don't have weather, or I don't have Wi-Fi, whatever it might be. Another person might say I can only do Zoom because I can't leave my house. And that might be conflictual, right? That might not be able to be gathered together in one. One example I'll quickly give of how consensus can be really helpful, Ian, if you go to the next slide. Consensus can be a really good tool because when we do a vote, it implies the conversation is over. And then with the gradients of agreement, not only do we get to show that, like, yes, there's a certain amount who are what we call weak consensus of twos here, and we can also show how many ones and what their concerns were, right? So an example I'll give is we did a legislative task force. We facilitated a legislative task force with the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, VDACS, 2 years ago now. Almost 2 years ago, where we were talking about animal testing in university facilities and transparency of that information. And that was highly contentious. We had 3 meetings because we needed to get the legislative report in by November, right? So we had 3 meetings to reach consensus, right? Wasn't going to happen. But what we were able to put in our report is on this proposal that this person put forward, X% were in agreement. And the people who weren't in agreement, who were twos, had these concerns that they would like to shift it to. And the people who had this, no one vote, they had these concerns. And that is really, really good information to give to a decision maker versus saying we had a 70% majority rules vote that said yes, right? That doesn't give you a lot of information about what concerns they had, why, how many people were really, really in favor, and how many people were like, okay, sure, I can vote just to move this forward. Those are all important pieces of information that lead again to that durability of the solution. So how do we, again, wrapping this all up in a neat phrase of like, we want durable solutions. So community engagement may be expensive, but it's in your vested interest to make sure that we create a process in which people are bought into the outcome and bought into the process through which we got there. All right, Ian.
All right, now we sell ourselves to our services. I just wanted to, before we kind of wrap up, tell you a little bit more about some of the sort of annual events that IEN conducts to really educate folks around this. One is the Virginia Natural Resources Leadership Institute, or VNRLE, which is an annual cohort of about 30 folks involved in the environmental sphere here in Virginia. It's a 6-session commitment over the course of the year across the state. It's like 2.5 days every 3 months or so. I think Blair, the VNRLE manager, I think might be on this call, but more information can be found at the website in the PowerPoint. And a newer version of sort of a newer training that we've kind of just started. I think Meredith has been involved in developing this, and I think our first time through ended earlier, or maybe last year. But it's community engagement design, effective collaboration in action. And so something that we host, it's going to be in May and October 2026 here in Charlottesville. It's a 3-day certificate training, so you will get an official effective collaboration certificate from us, from the Cooper Center, and you can register at the Cooper Center's website, or I guess the IN sub website in the Cooper Center's website. It's a mouthful. And oftentimes, people's sort of needs or curiosities don't maybe fit into those two boxes, right? We're not looking for a training. We might be looking to have IEN help with a project or develop a project. And so, yeah, we're here to help. We are a small but mighty staff, and we have a significant amount of different policy areas of expertise and years of experience doing facilitation. So, more often than not, we're able to either one of us, one of the senior associates or senior leadership here at IEN is able to help with the problem. We also have a sort of a bench of consultants of subject matter experts and facilitation experts that we work with pretty frequently to accommodate other needs. So yeah, you can feel free to reach out as needed. Um, and finally, Meredith mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that we gave this at the Portsmouth APA conference in the summer. Who knows when that was, July or August, or even June, I don't know. But here, we'll send the slides out afterwards, but here's a box folder with some of the resources from that presentation. There's some handouts and worksheets that go into effective collaboration and process design in a little bit more detail, but you can definitely take a look at those and use them as needed. And thank you. That here's our final slide. Here are our names. Here's a picture of us at a training. And yeah, I don't know, Meredith, do you have anything else?
I was just going to shout out the training that we most recently developed about community engagement is actually the title is community-based facilitation. Thank you. My brain is not working this morning. Community-based facilitation, and one of the pieces of it is community engagement design. Other components of it are like learning the foundations. We talked about IAP2. You'll learn how to put that into practice. And then also you do a practicum day of just like having to get a case study and then, okay, go do it. And our experts kind of give you some feedback as you walk through it. It's a really great thing. It'll be offered twice, I think, this year as a 3-day training instead of 3 different days across the year like it was last year. So that'll be coming up. And if you have any questions about it, you're welcome to email me. Yeah, I know we have a couple questions, so let's pivot.
Thank you both so much. Yes, the first question that came in, it looks like Ian had flagged as the best person to respond. Do you find this process,
Maybe.
or well, or at least flagged it to respond, I should.
Yeah.
Do you find this process is more effective with smaller groups or issues that are smaller in scope? It seems hard to administer for a planning issue that may have wide-scale opposition, not a single project, but something that affects an entire community on a broader scale.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and something that we wrestle with all the time. So obviously, some of the examples that we were describing were sort of the local, hyper-local issue, right? So this is like a distinct, discrete project in a place affecting a group of people that live in and around it, right? But really, you can take those same principles and kind of escalate them up to the commensurate scale, right? So we were just talking about some of the statewide projects that we've done. We've also worked with we worked on a project with the Forest Service talking about urban forestry. And really what that was thinking about is how are we basically getting, when I talked about some of the key connectors, maybe they're not community connectors, but they're like statewide connectors, or they work at organizations that need to be involved in a specific public process. So I hear that. And I think that it's important to kind of adjust a process as needed. For a planning issue that may have wide scale opposition statewide, certainly that's going to take a lot of time and effort to set the stage in a way that is going to produce a productive outcome, right? And that may be what folks don't want to hear sometimes, where it's like almost sometimes the smaller the issue, the less money it'll take to kind of understand what's happening. But when you're talking about some of these, if we're thinking about something like a data centers, right? That's a massive statewide issue that's highly contentious, being considered right now at the General Assembly, involves everyone in the state when you think about who, buys power in the state, right? Unless you produce your own power. So that is something that would take a long time to really develop the framework for. But it's better, in my opinion, to develop a framework that is good than rush into something that might not actually produce a good outcome. So we think about that all the time, thinking about scale. Also, this is sort of a side note, but you find that when you're working on a lot of statewide issues, you're kind of like calling the same, maybe like 20 people, like these people who are sort of like these subject matter experts or represent communities on a statewide level. Maybe they're always in and around Richmond this time of year, but understanding and appreciating that, like that, how much time or interest does this person even have to give to my process, like my project? Like my client might think it's important, but like they might be like, oh, great, another thing about X, right? And that's really important. Where recognizing that and kind of communicating back to that client that this might take a little bit longer than we
Yeah.
might have originally thought.
Ian is reading my brain here about my brain is around data centers. We are currently working on a research scale project thinking about data centers. And this is, I think, a really interesting part of what we are um, saying recreativity, because this is a project focused on Loudoun County. So when we're talking about like local scale things, but Loudoun County is we're still doing a public planning process that is full of residents, has a lot of people who are considering this issue and are impacted in various ways. So um, one thing about this is that we are being funded by a UVA Institute or Environmental Institute. So that helps in terms of creating a public planning process that has extra funding, built into it. But ultimately, we are partnering really, really, really deeply with the locality to do a grid reliability analysis, to look at spatial analysis, to give them information for what might lead to a ordinance review or reconsideration. And ultimately, that means that they're able to get some of the technical information they need. But we, as IEN component of this, are doing the community engagement part of that, are trying to make sure that we're centering lived experiences, or trying to make sure that we are engaging people throughout so that we're any consideration regarding policy solutions or anything as much as you haven't thought about the aesthetics, or the generators are worse than you're thinking, you're missing this component of how you think through this. There's a lot of knowledge to be gained from folks and their lived experience there. So that is like half the budget is community engagement, because we are doing so much work to build in people's 20 plus years of Loudoun County being the data center capital of the world, and really making sure that we understand that better. So definitely there are ways to do it, but as Ian mentioned, it's expensive. And so really getting creative about funding for that and who might be interested in funding that, and the durable solutions there is good.
Thank you both. The other question that came in states, I'm interested to hear more about IEN's experience bringing trauma-informed stories into the process. What approaches have worked for you? Have you used persona approaches, providing a timeline of the type of person affected by a decision without attribution when there is high mistrust?
Yeah. I mean, so I know that we have incorporated that approach in the past. Man, this is such a good question, and I think it's like we're always thinking about this. And I know that I would love to connect whoever asked this question maybe to Frank Dukes, who was former director at the Institute, but worked really, really closely on a lot of projects, including the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia, thinking about how to engage descendants of enslaved peoples in a way that is like equitable and actually sort of centering what they want out of, whatever the MEL ended up being. But it's really, really important, like, thinking about our role as facilitators, especially if we're thinking about something that involves racial trauma, thinking about our race, right? Thinking about our class, like how are we making sure that we recognize our role in systems that have perpetuated harm, but also to the extent possible, like avoiding re-traumatization during the interview, during the public process, like how are we handling, these stories and these sort of testimonies with like the appropriate and requisite care? Because I think there's a lot of public processes that do not do that. And in many ways, in some public processes, the more harm that they hear, it actually it's sort of counterintuitive, because you have to share so much that it could be so painful for anything to change. So it's our role to kind of be the conduit between those things. But I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it. And the persona approach that you identified is definitely one, but I would say this is a kind of a cop-out answer, but it's case by case, right? We're recognizing the amount of harm that had been inflicted. How are we making sure that we're not accentuating that or building on that by our identities, by our role in a process, by who we're working for or on behalf of. But that's such a great question. So that's what I have to offer.
I'll add another component of this that's not trauma that's tied to identity, but trauma that might be tied to experience of a death in the community, right? So I saw a couple folks on here who did the community-based facilitation with me and Ian, and so they'll be sick and tired of this example, but we used an example in that case study, in that class, on a traffic circle. And in one component of it, we while we were drafting that case study, we thought about including that there had been a bicycle death, right? And so that, adds this layer of tension to things. And then we decided, this is for a beginner class. Maybe that's too much. Maybe that's too many layers to add. But there are a lot of situations that can seem really well and truly highly contentious for personal reasons. And that can be uncomfortable to deal with as planners because we're like, I am not a therapist. I don't know how to be your professional holder of space for this. And I would say there's a lot to be learned about, yeah, there is a line, there's a definitive line, but how to make sure that we're doing community care and really thinking through the balancing act of offering space for people to be empowered to tell their stories and to feel their stories. And if we are empowering them, can we ensure that it is a soft landing place for that story? We don't want to be debating people's lived experience about things. And that's part of our job as facilitators, to Ian's point of like making sure we're not re-traumatizing people. One way that we do that is thinking through if this is, a testimony to General Assembly, maybe they want to do it, but maybe they don't. Maybe, we don't want them to feel pushed. If it's to a group, like I'm thinking, if there was a public town hall and there had been a proposal for a traffic circle and someone had been a pedestrian death there, right? We don't want to go to the family and say, hey, you want to speak at the town hall? Because we can't ensure that everyone at the town hall isn't going to be belligerent or isn't going to attack someone or isn't going to, be like, that's nice that your son died, but like, there are other things to consider here, right? That gets way too close to offering someone as a sacrificial lamb, and so we want to make sure that we're offering it. We can ensure a soft landing place for someone to share something so deeply personal if we are asking it. Now, if they volunteer it, we do our best to facilitate the room and make sure that we're holding respect as a core value, but we don't want to ask anyone to provide information that we can't ensure a soft landing place for. And yeah, definitely talk to Frank. He's the expert on this. I really wish Frank or Tanya were here because they have so many example case studies that they could pull out of their back pocket, having been at IEN since the 90s. All
Well,
right. Any other questions?
it it looks like there are no further questions. Feel free to plug them in now while I finish up with some housekeeping items and thank Meredith and Ian for sharing their resources and tools to help planners navigate their work and ensure that the community is put first. Thank you so much, as always, to your wonderful team. I don't know if you all have any final remarks, but just a reminder to our speakers or to our attendees, excuse me, that the recording will be shared to the YouTube page in the coming days. We will get the CM information to you as soon as we have it. And stay tuned for the next webinars in our series. Next up, we actually have a Mid-Atlantic planning collaboration, which will be on the second Thursday of each month moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think this has been really lovely. I appreciate all of your time over this lunch hour. And it definitely, if you are interested in learning more about how to put those 6 principles into practice, there is worksheets and really cool information in that box folder that we shared that you are welcome to take advantage and put into practice in your work. We hope you do.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Yes, thank you, Jillian.
Thank you. And we will be sending out that box folder link along with the presentation to attendees as well. And I know that both our speakers are happy to be a resource. So we'll provide contact information as well.
Perfect.
Thank you, everyone. Stay warm.
Yes.